So PlayerUnknown'S Battlegrounds has become the third most played game on Steam recently, and with that a lot of new people are playing the game. This guide's aim is to help experienced and inexperienced players at the same time create a fluid communication line between their teammates and themselves. The focus on this guide isn't going to be about bearings or calling out direction, or even effectively placing markers so that your teammates know where enemies are, as I believe those skills develop as you get more experience in the battleground. Instead, we're going to be talking about building names, what we should call them in a duo and squad game, and how we can effectively communicate those things to our teammates. So what I'll do for the rest of the video is show you a building, tell you what I call it, and what I've heard it called. There's always an open-in for people to name things differently, and for that I would love for you guys to put in the comments what you call the buildings. If there's a consensus in the comments over a building name, I will annotate it on YouTube afterwards. Just before we go over the building names, I'll speak on some of the many variables you'll find in the battleground, so let's get into it. In any way trying to tell you or anyone else what to call these buildings, I'm simply opening a line of communication where we as a group can express our personal callouts and hopefully develop a much fuller complete list to use while duking it out on the battleground. I love you, baby. Before we continue, I have to address the fact that calling out a building name isn't always going to be the most effective technique to communicating where an enemy is. Oftentimes the same buildings line up next to each other, or a great number of other obstacles get in our way. When this does happen, I hope you use the compass and the color schemes of the buildings to effectively communicate to your team where the enemy is. Now let's name some buildings. First up, we have the house I call Martyrs House. I call it this because my friends always seem to die in there. I've also heard it called duplex, but that doesn't seem to make sense to me because there's not two separate living areas. There's also a single story variation of this building that I call single martyr. This happens pretty often in PUBG where they just barely change a building, and we'll go over them as they come. Next up we have the halfway house. I've also heard this called twin balconies or dual balconies, but I feel like that's a mouthful in the midst of battle. I've personally found when playing third-person perspective games, this house is a very hot spot for action, as a lot of people want to get vision from its utility. Next we have Big Mommas House. This is a very common building in the battleground, and it's fairly easy to identify. I've never heard this building called anything else, and I looked up online and someone else actually calls this Big Mommas House as well. It's pretty easy to identify because of the two balconies above both the back and the front door, and based on that one appearance trait, it can be easily distinguished from the next building on our list. Hero's House is another very commonly found building in the battleground. Unlike Big Mommas House, it has one balcony and it is much longer. There's no stairwell in the center, and generally speaking this house provides a lot of cover. I call it Hero House after seeing several streamers do heroic things inside of it. It's a two-story building but also has a variation where it's a single story, which I call Stubby. I used to call it SingleHeroes, but there was some confusion over it, and Stubby is more applicable because it's a long, flat, single-story house. As you can see, the whole inside stays the same. I really like what Bluehole has done with copying the buildings and making single and double story buildings and little variations. It really adds a lot to the game. Next up we have the building I call CrackHouse. I call it CrackHouse because of what the inside looks like. I heard a streamer one time refer to another building as CrackHouse, and if anyone knows what that building is, please leave a comment down below. As you can see when we go upstairs, the house is pretty beat up. One room has a chair and a bunch of cupboards behind it, and the other room has two beds on the ground. Kind of looks like a junkie pit, so that's why I've always called it CrackHouse. Another very commonly found house is the poor man's house. It's a single story building that's found just about in every city. It has one bedroom, one bathroom, and one kitchen. This building personifies what the rest of my life's housing situation is going to be, so I just thought poor man's house was very applicable. Next up is the Whoville House. There are a good deal of variations of this building that you find on the battlegrounds. Some have 2 stories with the roof, some have 3 stories with the roof, some have 2 stories with the connected building. But all in all, the one thing that you want to note when calling out Whoville House is this balcony right here. That is a concurring theme that never goes away, and you should always recognize. This is a building I call Gawdss Hauss. It's always 1 story. I don't think there's any variations, to be honest. But generally speaking, you always find it accompanying a bigger house, so I thought Gawdss Hauss was a proper name. Now, this is a building I've heard named 100 times 100 different ways. I've heard Sniper Tower, I've heard Harry Potter House, I've heard Harry Potter Tower, I've heard Wizard Tower. I'd just like to hear what you guys call it, to be honest, because I recognize all those. So let me know in the comments down below, please. Next up is the Sherlock House. Sherlock House is pretty easy to distinguish because of the little peephole right there. There are some variations where the upstairs will actually take you to a roof, and I still call that Sherlock House. It's pretty easy to distinguish based on the visual appearance. I've heard this house called SafeHouse and also Cardboard. I'm assuming Cardboard comes from the number of cardboard boxes inside, but I've always found SafeHouse to be a better name because it is a very secure building, and oftentimes I use it late in game to solidify my position in the top 10. I call this building Supermarket. People have also called it Market in the past, but there's actually a smaller variation that I call Market, seen here, that I think fits that title more. This building is fairly rare though, so don't worry too much. Next up we have the gas station, but as I have a lot of British friends and I don't like getting yelled at, this is called the Petrol Station. Next up we have the Parlor. I call this Parlor because there was an ice cream cooler in the one I saw, and also because it just looks like a storefront property, so. Next up being the BarnHouse. There are several variations of this building, one including a roof and one with an attachment on the side. It's a very common building and also very effective for eyes. I refer to this building as Storefront as it has a little business section up front and also has a living situation upstairs. There are some variations of this building and they are fairly common. These next two buildings are difficult because you never want to name a building by color, but I've always called this Little Yellow. It's a skinnier version, or Skinny Yellow. It's a skinnier version of the other yellow house seen here, and I've always called this one Big Yellow. I've called this one the TeaHouse, but I've also heard it called the Diner. I call it the TeaHouse because there are teacups on the second floor tables, and there are variations of this building. Next up we have the Swap Meet. This is a building I call Swap Meet just because there's so many selling areas in the bottom. I don't think I've ever heard this called out or named, so if you guys have a different name, please share it below. Next up we have the flats, or the apartments. I've heard them called both, it just matters, once again, petrol, gas station type of thing. But it's important to note when you're talking about these, direction should always be one of the most important things, and also color scheme. If you're in some cities, they have different color schemes going up the apartments. It's a good way to identify because all the buildings do look incredibly similar. I call this building Death Shed. I do that because oftentimes at the power plant, it turns out 5 people have died around them. This is called the Garage. I've also heard it called the Mechanic's Tent, but I think Garage is more to the point and clean, so I'd go with that. Next up we have the Mayor's Mansion. I've also heard the Governor's House. Either way, it's a rich guy who has a big house. It's found quite a lot on the map in the big cities, and I've never heard it called anything. This is the Police Station. That says police in Russian right there. I did a Google search and you'll quickly find the same thing. Also, there's wanted posters on the front lobby and just general prison feel. Next up we have the ShitShack. I've also heard this called Fuckboy Hut, but I actually reserved that for the next building on our list, right here. It's called Fuckboy Hut because a lot of people abuse third person and just look through the little crack and wait till the end. So that's the end of the list for civilian buildings. I hope it helped you in some way or another, and I hope you can help me by giving me more suitable suggestions for the building names. If enough people comment and there's enough changes that I make, I'll just make another video kind of in the same format with the new building names. Really appreciate you guys stopping by, and I hope to see you out there on the battlegrounds.